Welcome back. And Caroline Karp is our senior lecturer in the Center for Environmental Studies, and she's going to moderate us this session.
欢迎大家光临布朗大学. Okay, I had to practice that several times, but that actually allows me to introduce or say thank you again in public to Jean Lowenstein and Lin Lang Hay, who have just done incredible work getting this meeting put together. So my job is actually quite simple. I'm going to introduce Timmins Roberts and then Guy Edwards, and they're going to deliver a joint paper that's titled Three Hungry Giants: China, the US, and the EU in the Search for Resources in the Developing World. After they give their lecture, I will then introduce the panel here who will talk about their experience in Durban during the Conference of the Parties. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Timmins Roberts. He is the director for Brown Center for Environmental Studies, which is where I work. He's also the Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology. Timmins came to Brown 3 years ago. He's only been here for 3 years, and before coming, he directed the program in Environmental Science and Policy at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And then he worked in Latin American Studies and Sociology at Tulane University and developed a reputation in environmental justice. His doctorate is in Sociology of International Development from Johns Hopkins University. He's either co-authored or edited over 8 books and over 60 articles and book chapters. His current research focuses on climate change and international development, especially relations between the global north and the global south, and the role of foreign aid. He is one of the co-founders of a remarkable database called aiddata.org, and it's an international effort that basically is trying to create transparency in foreign aid. More locally, he's been a leader in Rhode Island's efforts to start a climate adaptation commission, and that commission is based on legislation that was drafted in 2010 with Timmins and a class of undergraduate students. So, and I want to introduce Guy Edwards, who I think you're going to be seeing digitally in a few minutes.
Well, there's be hearing him.
Oh, you'll hear him. You won't get to see him.
From above.
So, Guy, I'm sorry about that. It'd be nice to actually have you here. So, Guy Edwards is a visiting fellow at Brown Center for Environmental Studies, although my understanding is he Skypes in every week for meetings with Timmins Climate Lab, and which is what he's doing today as a way to save carbon, so his carbon footprint is lower as a result. He has a master's degree in Latin American Studies from the Institute for the Study of the Americas at the University of London, and he's worked for the Overseas Development Institute and as an Inter-American Development Bank consultant at the Waorani Eco Lodge in the Amazon. He founded intercambioclimatico.com, Latin America's first multilingual website, which focuses on climate change, and it's a partnership between Brown and the Latin American Platform on Climate Change. He also has a number of publications, and his most recent publication is a co-authored chapter on the state of Latin American and European relations in a volume on Latin America and globalization. So both have a great deal of experience in the climate negotiations and on trade that's directed at climate, and with that I welcome Timmins and Guy Edwards.
Thanks, Caroline. Okay, this is going to be a technological miracle if it works. And thank you all for your being here. And this is sort of our sneaky way to have experts look at our work and give us some feedback. So we hope it works. So Guy, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have 2 computers up here actually on top of each other, so we'll see. Okay, so Guy, you want to go ahead?
Right. Thank you very much, Caroline. And good afternoon to you. Before I start, I would like to thank the Watson Institute's Director, Caroline Dean, and Professor Matt Gutman, and the Centre for Environmental Studies, especially Timmins Roberts. Our apologies in advance for a rather text-heavy presentation. We decided to do this in case the audio was not that clear, so you could all follow along comfortably. So if we go on to the next slide,
yep.
Please. So general confidence in Latin America has grown significantly with impressive reductions in poverty, substantial improvements in education, and an increasingly assertive foreign policy. Latin America's adept handling of the financial crisis left it relatively unscathed, its recovery was driven by strong economic growth, sound macroeconomic and monetary policies, record levels of foreign direct investment in 2010, higher commodity prices, and huge demand from Asia for the region's raw materials. Commodity exports are again a key economic area for the region, and these exports consist of minerals, hydrocarbons, natural gas and oil, agricultural and livestock, forestry and fishery products. Next slide. As you can see, Latin America has a very impressive endowment of natural resources. Of note, the region has 25% of the planet's arable land, 22% of phosphorus, 10% of its oil, and 31% of its freshwater resources. 5 of the world's 10 most biodiverse countries can also be found in the region, those being Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. Next slide.
Yep.
As we have already mentioned, the robust growth observed in Latin America is an important reflection of the region's ties with China. Although other countries, in particular the United States and the members of the European Union, also play a considerable role in Latin America, we're going to focus the presentation primarily on China. So as you can see, from 2005 to 2010, China's trade with Latin America grew twice as fast as its trade with the world overall. If one excludes Mexico, which has shown a pattern of exports more strongly linked to manufacturing, of the remaining Latin American exports, over 70% are natural resource-based commodities. Chinese multinationals invested more than 15 billion in the region in 2010, making China the third largest investor after the US and the Netherlands. Finally, more than 90% of those investments went to natural resource extraction, mostly in the oil and gas sector and mining. Next slide. So it's very interesting to note that the China Development Bank and other Chinese institutions have spent an estimated 75 billion on financial investments in South America, which is more investment than the World Bank, US Export Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank put together. In May 2009, the China Development Bank lent 10 billion to Brazil's Petrobras in exchange for a guaranteed supply of oil over the next decade. China has also shown interest in investing in the Venezuelan and Argentinian oil sectors. In 2009 as well, the former Brazilian Trade Secretary, Welber Barral, declared a historic moment when China replaced the US to become Brazil's most important trading partner. So, China in Latin America, we can observe some of the risks and rewards. Most Latin Americans welcome Chinese investment in infrastructure. However, the assumption in Latin America is that the current economic model leads simultaneously to economic growth, social disintegration, and environmental degradation, with a marked trend towards more income concentration. There is also limited evidence that the partnership with China is accompanied by a process of technological fusion and knowledge spillovers, which are needed urgently to spur productivity. Finally, government's concern over land grabs and food security, brought on in part by Chinese interest in agricultural livestock sectors, has led to restrict foreign land ownership. So, next slide. Looking at the impacts, commodity-led economic growth has put Latin American natural resources under tremendous pressure, and this model is one of the principal factors explaining the lack of success of environmental policies in the region. Some of these impacts include increased land clearing, habitat loss for agro-exports, mineral resources extracted at great environmental cost to water resources, air pollution, and land contamination. And finally, forced migration and displacement of peoples for mechanization of agriculture or hydroelectric plant. So what's driving biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation in Latin America? Well, here we've got 4 particular issues. Many governments fail to recognise the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which are not reflected in the decision-making process. Secondly, government policies often inadvertently promote environmental degradation or subsidise unsustainable activities, such as the replacement of primary forests with biofuels. Many countries lack appropriate legislation to conserve biodiversity and ensure sustainable natural resource management. And where such legislation exists, there is often limited capacity or willingness to enforce these rules. And finally, economic forces such as growing markets for agricultural products and natural resources, increased commercialization and globalization are also driving resource use patterns, often negative impacts on natural ecosystems. So we can see civil society beginning to respond to these new issues. Growing social movement, activism, and national politics are found from Peru to Argentina due to mining, agricultural, and other agreements the Chinese have signed with Latin American governments that local populations believe violate their rights. But social controls and formal legal systems are not well positioned to regulate these impacts sufficiently nor quickly. So,
we're losing you.
What impact will the extraction boom have on national profiles of emissions, and in particular on historically excellent ratio of human development per tonne of carbon released into the atmosphere? Secondly, how has China approached the region's states, private sectors, and civil societies, and how have they responded to China? Finally, when the choice is between economic development and environmental and climate protection and posed as such, how are governments in the region responding? So we can see that a few Latin American nations are global models of achieving high human development with low levels of carbon emissions, which was achieved previously before concern about climate change started. 2 such examples are Costa Rica and Colombia. Secondly, Latin America has pioneered work in pursuing environmental objectives in a development context and has moved toward a more sustainable development pathway. Next slide. So, having impacts and when governments from Mexico to the Andean region are taking climate change increasingly seriously following a wave of destructive natural disasters. Impacts of climate change in the region include intensification of weather patterns and storms, floods and droughts, the potential collapse of the Caribbean coral biome, warming of high Andean ecosystem, and the risk of potential dieback of young. So, taking a look at our country studies, at the moment we are focusing on Brazil, Costa Rica, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. And as you might have guessed, we have some initial findings from our work in Ecuador. So, for instance, in March 2012, the Ecuadorian government signed an agreement with Chinese mining company Embodied to invest $1.4 billion in a copper mining project in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa has hailed the agreement as marking the start of a new era and says royalties and taxes from the mine will fund development projects including schools and hospitals. In response, indigenous protesters mobilized in March against a large-scale mining project, with Ecuador's main indigenous group stating mining will damage the environment and will displace entire communities. At first glance, it would seem that even though Ecuador's environmental and climate legislation is very progressive, the government's growing interest in mining and oil exploration risks undermining Ecuador's green image. However, Chinese investment is also financing a multi-billion-dollar hydroelectric project in the country. The dam is to be completed in 2016 and will cover 35% of the country's energy needs. The Ecuadorian government hopes the project will contribute to its national target of reaching 6% alternative energy participation in the total installed capacity by 2013. There are also hopes that the project dam will be electric in clean development mechanism, potentially millions of dollars in carbon credits. So, a few concluding thoughts. China is clearly leading the resources boom in Latin America. And the particular question we are focusing on is really China's in Latin America is being built right now. So will it be one of protection or devastation? Also, if this is Latin America's decade, what is going to be the result of it? Will there be enduring interest in Latin America in protecting the environment and tackling climate change? Secondly, how will countries balance the need for investment in natural resources and climate and environmental protection? Looking at climate issues, both adaptation and mitigation, these need to overcome domestic political obstacles and be factored in to national development plan. And lastly, Latin America should be able to benefit considerably from Chinese interests in the region, but only if national leaders think strategically about the imperatives of low carbon and resilient growth models. Thanks very much.
Well, that's a relief. You could kind of understand that. And we tried to telegraph the points there, so with both the slides and the text. So I guess we should do some questions now. Is that a good thing? So Guy, I'll field them from here, and Guy's going to listen. Graciela's typing them in, right, in Skype chat or something over there. And then I'll try a first crack, and then we'll go ahead with give Guy a chance if I can't do it. Debbie.
So Debbie Saladson from the World Resources Institute. I have two questions. The first one regards your use of the word China. I'm not a big follower of Latin America, but I'm well aware of the Chevron Ecuador case, for example, and there's a long history of problems with natural resources companies from the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, and many other places. What about differentiating Chinese companies from China as a whole and being clear who's investing what, where? I think Erica Downs at Brookings has done excellent work on Chinese oil companies in Africa that I think you should look at, and the difference between the government and the companies. Wenran Jiang at the University of Alberta is also really good, again, mainly working on Africa rather than Latin America, but I think they're good references for you. And what both of them point out in particular is there's this huge range from government to government deals, many of which never actually happen, to private company deals, some of which at the state sector happen if there's Chinese state-owned enterprises before the government even knows about it, to small-scale private enterprise where the government often never knows that it's happening, the Chinese government, that is. And that's often particularly the case in areas like agriculture and forestry where you have a lot of small players. So I think it's worth looking at it, and it's also worth taking seriously that China actually has a fairly diverse economy. Second question for you, I was at the China Wind Expo this last fall, which is now the largest wind exhibition in the world. And the big news of that expo was the growth of the Latin American market. And it's actually the most rapidly rising wind market in the world, and a lot of manufacturing, particularly in Brazil, for the whole Latin market. And it's an interesting one because the Chinese companies aren't active at all in Latin America. So I think it's also interesting to think about where renewables and other sort of clean energy fit into this story.
Right. So I'll start with just a small response on the first point. I think Chinese investors are getting lumped together, and I think that's often unfortunate. Maybe it's just a matter of time before people are seeing more, distinguishing features of different types of investment. But in our scholarship, we definitely want to make it, make clear the difference, and we'll look up those. Those are great people, and that's really helpful. On this, and I'll get Guy to weigh in here in a minute if you're getting it, Guy. On the second one on renewables, we did try to point out that there is this, pretty large investment going on in renewables, especially in hydro, that we're able to keep track of so far in Latin America. But I was going to say on this first point again, that yes, I mean, when you start talking about Chevron in Ecuador, I thought you meant that, the U.S. firms have gotten a bad name, especially in oil exploration in the Amazon and so on, and Texaco and so on. And that is true, and I think that's part of the issue, that China may get, in some ways, some of the backlash that was from earlier decades of, both contamination and the social movement organizing against earlier polluters.
Well, but my point was that people say Chevron, they say Texaco.
Chevron, and they don't say U.S. government. U.S. Right? No, I got that. Yeah, but I do think that China will suffer some of the coming into an already sort of contaminated social landscape. I guess that's part of our point here. Guy, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I was just going to say, I think the Ecuadorian case study is already throwing up some quite interesting things. That, for instance, we can see that the China Development Bank has made vast loans to the country, and the Ecuadorian mining project is just one part of that. And obviously, as we mentioned before, quite a lot of the loans are being channeled into hydro projects as well. And it's interesting that China's policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, which came out in 2008, they actually make specific references to trying to strengthen practical cooperation with Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly in infrastructure and hydro. And they also have sections in the policy paper talking about cooperation on climate change and environmental protection as well. So although it's kind of early days for our research to say which is kind of winning in terms of the sustainability of the Chinese investment, I think the Chinese are clearly approaching the region in in a way that suggests they're very conscious of these issues, particularly climate change. And one thing I noticed just kind of digging around for some of these numbers was that it's very difficult to determine the levels of Chinese foreign direct investment loans and aid in Latin America. So I think that's a particular obstacle we're going to come up against as we delve a little deeper. And on the renewables question, the penetration of Chinese companies in Latin America compared to European and US companies is significantly less. And as far as I'm aware, well, up until the financial crisis, European companies were the most dominant in the market, particularly from Spain, Spanish renewable companies.
Thanks, Guy. Dan, did you have your hand up?
Yeah,
Just
I
Dan
have two
Reesmatter.
kind of quick questions. One is, when Congress says developing countries, most often they mean China. So when you say Latin America, do you really mean Brazil? It wasn't clear, you're talking about Latin America. Is it really Latin America or is it Brazil? Is my one question. The other question I had for you is along the lines of what Debbie asked, perhaps. and that is, has the pattern of investment changed at all? I mean, does the Chinese pattern of investment, has that changed appreciably from what had existed in the past? Or have we simply got people buying up Latin American resources from China in the way they used to buy them up from other places? Is it still all about resource extraction? As you said, apart from Mexico, 90%, I think it was maybe
73%.
of the rest is all natural, is all resource extraction.
Right, I guess that's one of our big points, is it's sort of back to the future for Latin America, that it was starting to get away from natural resource dependence as a development model. And that was taking decades, and so this sort of represents a return to an old model that could be different this time, or may well not be different this time. So I think it's the region itself is seeing this economic growth, has really shown that it's tightly linked to China's economy, which grew through the economic crisis as well. So I don't know if this is enough of an answer, but I think it's a case where it isn't that different than the earlier phase, but there's sort of this intervening phase that was more in the region to try to diversify away from resources.
If I could, do you know anything about whether there's any sort of code of conduct or guidelines for Chinese companies doing business, Chinese enterprises doing business in Latin America or anywhere else? Is there any such thing that exists, or in terms of trying to ensure that some of these other considerations are maybe taken into account?
Right, so on codes of conduct, I would say each industry has sort of the best practices. Some have stronger industry organizations, some have different kinds of membership. This is a non-answer, I'm sorry. But there's no formal, across-the-board codes of conduct across the region.
Chinese Exim has one. Exim has one.
Perhaps just to follow this, I want to share some thoughts just after listen to the presentation. One, that I think there was a question or those issues raised in the slides about the China's policy, how that would influence Latin America. At least I can share to one example. Chile. Chile now currently is exploring domestic emissions trading scheme, and one of the reasons is why they are interested in domestic emissions trading scheme, and they indicated that, of course, they say if you look at their major trading partners, one is EU, another one is China. China even more important than EU. So if China is putting in place domestic trading scheme, and they also want to say that that have in the far future, and that will have implications on Chile's export. So in that sense, that's one of the reasons they cited as that's why they are interested in the domestic emissions trading scheme. So you already see some, at least a positive impact. And then on this whole environmental social safeguards, and we have seen a lot of publicity, and agree with David, sometimes we do need to make a distinction between China, Chinese government, and companies. And a lot of companies, the Chinese government probably doesn't know where they are, what they are doing, certain full control. I had, the World Bank has this exchange programs with the Exim Bank and China Development Bank. So one of the objectives is also train the staff in those two banks about the World Bank social environmental safeguards. And I had some discussions with them after they finished their exchange programs about their reflections, how Exim Bank and how China Development Bank really put in place the standards. I had those conversations at different times with different people, and amazingly that they all of them that of course they say they learn quite a lot, but at the same time they also say that one thing is that they have drawn the conclusion. Seems to me that is that we, China, as a developing country, so we understand the concerns of other developing countries. So also we understand how you really apply to environmental social safeguards. And they defend themselves, it's not that we do not have safeguards, and we are also developing and putting in place corporate safeguards, but we understand that so environmental social safeguards, country by country, different, and you have to apply it differently. And they themselves have exchanged the period. And so there's some experience, I think, implying that sometimes if not the World Bank, other institutions, perhaps somehow we have very stringent rigid standards, and they raise the question that whether those standards really all the time suitable for all the countries. They pride themselves in the sense that they understand and the developing countries' particular circumstances, and they know how to apply in an appropriate manner. So just share some information.
That's extremely helpful. I think this is really the beginning of our work. We've just sort of started this, and it's one piece of a larger book on Latin America and climate change policy. So we're kind of coming up from the Latin America side, and that's why this is extremely helpful to help us nuance these points. I don't know, Guy, do you want to add something on those? I'm going to ask all you who have pointed these things out to help us as we go along, if you would.
Right, thanks, Dennis. I was just going to respond to the gentleman who asked about Brazil. China actually signed its first free trade agreement in the region with Chile in 2006, and it then went on to sign another free trade agreement with Peru in 2008, and I believe they're trying to sign another free trade agreement with Costa Rica at the moment. So I think Brazil is definitely one of the main headline stories about China's involvement in the region. But it seems to be focused more, apart from the Costa Rica example, in South America, which are definitely placing more emphasis on commodity-based exports. I think there's a partial correlation with China's booming growth and its growing hunger for natural resources to power that growth. And there's a Chinese professor, I've got a paper by him, and he was talking about how China's move into Latin America, in his opinion, was largely motivated by the pressing issue of energy security. So again, we can see that a large chunk of Chinese investment is going into securing energy resources, such as the example with Brazil's Petrobras, but also in Venezuela, Argentina, and Cuba as well.
Should we take one more or something, or should we move on? I did want to make the tie to Ming Shu's paper. It's going to be this afternoon, where a lot of his work is on this embodied emissions in trade. That is, when we count responsibility of nations for climate change, under the current system, we don't count where their raw materials and their energy came from. So the U.S. or Europe, when we reduce our emissions, that's happening at the same time as we're, exporting our jobs in manufacturing, and so all that production now happening in China. So China rightly makes the point that it's harder for it to reduce its emissions when it's doing much of the energy-intensive part of the production chain. Well, this is another layer to that story. That is, we have all these, nations in Latin America that are now exporting often quite energy-intensive products to China, who then manufactures, and then those are traded over to the United States and Europe and so on. So it raises all these questions about how we account for carbon. So that'll be interesting tie-in. So thank you all for the feedback on this. I'm really relieved that it worked, and I appreciate the feedback. And any more feedback, please email us. So next, we're going to do the Brown report. So Guy, you hold on. Maybe you can mute your mic until it's your turn.
Sure. Thanks very much.
For some reason, I thought you were going to talk as well.
I am.
You are?
I'm part of the team, yes,
Oh, okay.
but I'm not first.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to get to introduce a variety of students, with some of whom I know and some of whom I barely know, but I think what I'll try to do is go in order, and so I want to introduce David Siplett first. He's a doctoral candidate in sociology at Brown University. His research focuses on global climate change and energy regulatory policy making in the United States. He is the co-author of a chapter in the new edition of Global Environmental Politics, which is coming out later this year. The chapter is The Politics of international climate adaptation funding, justice, and divisions in the greenhouse. And he has a number of climate reports, policy reports that came out of the Durban meeting. And one of those, for example, is adaptation finance, how Durban can deliver on past promises. And then Lin Lang Hay is to his right, David's right. Lin Lang is a first-year master's candidate in environmental studies, and she is going to be looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is this 9-state carbon trading regime. And I think her interest is seeing what China and other places might learn from this cap-and-trade system and how the auction revenues are going to be used here. And then to Lin Lang's right is Graciela Kincaid, who is a senior undergraduate concentrator in international relations. She'll graduate in May. She is looking at the Obama administration's rhetoric on climate and also climate finance policy over the course of his first term in office. And then to Graciela's right is Spencer Fields, who's a senior. He's also graduating in May. He's a senior concentrator in environmental studies, and his thesis looks at the role that foreign investment in mining has influenced environmental policy and regulation in Bolivia. And then to Spencer's right is Brianna Kraft, and Brianna is a first-year graduate student, first-year master's candidate in environmental studies. And her thesis is focused on the intersection between the least developed country negotiating bloc and the issue of technology transfer. So an interesting topic. And then to Brianna's right is Adam Coton, who is a second-year graduate student. He'll be graduating in May and going off into the world. He is completing his master's in environmental studies. His thesis is on the implications of federal farm disaster policy for climate adaptation. And then to Adam's right is Kelly Rogers, who is a master's candidate in public policy, and she is focusing on congressional and political responses to international climate negotiations and the global energy industry's private sector influence on climate policy. So thanks to all of you for coming today. And they're going to present their work on what happened in Durban.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm handing it over to Dave Sibley.
I'm going to begin by talking about the Climate and Development Lab. This is some of the members of our group in Durban in December. And you can see we're in front of the documents center there, trying to get ready for the day. So this group began in November of 2010 and is headed up by Professor Timmons Roberts. The mission is to contribute timely, accessible, impactful content that informs more just and effective global policy making on climate change. And we have several members of our group, 15 participants, some of which are here, and some are also in the audience. And these are master's students, undergraduate students, PhD students, and we have 2 fellows. One is Guy Edwards, and then Mizan Khan, negotiator from Bangladesh, has been kind enough to work with us as well. And we have a few main foci that we've been centering our work around. And these include climate finance and the least developed countries, which Brianna will talk more about, the 48 poorest countries in the world. Latin America focus, which you heard some about, the US and US climate politics, and also agriculture. And this group participated both in negotiations in Cancun and in Durban. So this is our website, and if you want to check it out, we have there's content that's continuously updated, and you can go to climatedevlab.wordpress.com, and you can see on the right side here just a few of the recent posts. There's one that's ecological debt and climate justice after Durban, time for some practical politics. There's another one here, why the UNFCCC needs more countries like Mexico. So these are blog entries that are being generated by members of the group and by Professor Roberts, Guy Edwards, and Mizan Khan. And just to show some of our products and what we're doing as a group, these are some examples. This is one that Guy Edwards worked on with the CDKN, which is the British government funding DFID. This is a piece in the Washington Post that cited Brianna looking at
no, it's Graciela.
Graciela, sorry, looking at some of the issues around U.S. climate politics. And the last one is with the organization IIED, and it's looking at climate finance. And we have a series of additional briefing papers that we've been working on. We also have 2 books, one of which you heard about. The other is Power in a Warming World. And again, we have many blog entries that we're continually producing to try to influence politics in a positive direction. Now pass the microphone to Timmons to talk about U.S. and China climate policy.
So we're each going to talk for 2 minutes, so this should go pretty fast. I did want to acknowledge Emily Kirkland, who's here. She's also in the group, and Becca Keene. I think we've got everybody that are here. So my job in this now 1.5 minutes is to talk about China and the U.S. You've already heard plenty. The points that we thought we should at least highlight are that the U.S. has this long historical role in negotiations and shaping the sort of whether the negotiations were going to go forward. Each year, everybody's waiting for the U.S. to come on board and make a change so that the world can come to some kind of a climate agreement at these talks. But each year, people are frustrated as the U.S. I would say that we're often considered the fossil of the day or the year by the Climate Action Network, for example. China, though, is rising economically, geopolitically, and is having this huge climate impact. You've heard plenty about that today. The point, though, about the U.S. was that we were really blocked because of the Byrd-Hagel resolution in 1997, passed just before the Kyoto meetings back in July of that year, that passed 95-0 in the U.S. Senate, that said that the U.S. shall make no commitment to a treaty that does not include also binding commitments by China and India in the same period of time. So that's been really why this focus on symmetry and all these other efforts to try to have some kind of commitments from India and China. So then the UN process was moving along from the Bali meetings in 2007. It was supposed to end in Copenhagen, and then there was sort of this breakdown at Copenhagen in the bottom-up texts, including from the group, the LCA group that Dan Riefsnyder was chairing. So then basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China got together with the United States in Copenhagen and drafted this Copenhagen Accord. The open question that we're talking about a lot in this book with Dave and Mizan, and that I have in a paper about China and the U.S., is whether the U.S., as it's in this period of sort of hegemonic decline, that is, we're having more and more difficulty being competitive globally. We're seeing an economic crisis that's been very difficult for us to get out of, but more structurally, we have a problem of aging infrastructure and difficulty. Anyway, you know all the problems with the American economy. Countries in those kind of situations generally do not take care of global public goods. They're unwilling to risk their economic survival in that kind of situation. So the question really that addresses us is, will China be able to step in where the U.S. was so unwilling? It's an ironic question, but it's the one that I'm going to try to raise in some of this work. So what's to come in the rest of the presentations, we'll be focusing much more on Durban as we try to understand what happened there. As we heard a little bit this morning, it may have been a really important turning point in the negotiations, at least procedurally, as Shui-Man said this morning. So let's go on, and now we're going to hear from Wenlai, who gets extra time because she's talking about China.
Thank you.
Is it working? Can anybody hear it? Are they coming through on
Can you
this?
hear us without a microphone?
It helps a little for the Skype and for the camera to have that thing working.
Okay, thank you very much, Timmons.
I think it's on.
My part of presentation is titled China in Durban. But really, having had so many excellent presenters telling us wonderful stories, I think it's a bad idea to try to preach to the choir, or 班门弄斧, as how we say it in Chinese. So instead, what I'm going to do is basically talk about my observation in Durban. So the activities that I followed, key issues that I was interested in, and etc. So, general introduction. Chinese delegation team in Durban was one of the largest, consisting around 140 people. And China was one of the very few countries that launched its own pavilion. The pavilion showcased 23 events, including forums and exhibitions featuring what China is doing and what China will do to address climate change in the context of building a sustainable economy.
Next.
China was no doubt a very important player in Durban. China's head delegate, Mr. Xie Zhenhua, made it clear at the very beginning that Chinese government's position is open, positive, constructive in taking part in these negotiations, and China would like to unite all parties to further facilitate the negotiation process. Next. In my opinion, China was really well prepared for the Durban conference because before going to Durban, the Information Office of the State Council released a white paper titled China's Policies and Actions for Addressing Climate Change, listing the country's mitigation and adaptation plans in line with its most recent 5-year plan and its achievements so far, and also reiterating China's basic positions in international climate change negotiations. One of the highlights in the white paper was the need to negotiate, to initiate South-South cooperation. And next. And I think that was not empty talk, because as what I observed in Durban, there are so many events relating to South-South cooperation. Panel discussion on sharing and cooperation between China and Africa was held, suggesting potential areas of Africa-China cooperation, including agricultural adaptation, safety nets that make farms more resilient to climate change, community-level irrigation, etc. And actually, Professor Yinglong Xu was on that panel, the China and Africa agricultural adaptation, and that was how I got to meet him and had the honor to invite him. Also, we had forum presentation and discussion on South-South cooperation, bringing together ministers from China, Grenada, Mali, Congo, representatives from African Union Commissions and Alliance of Small Island States, the Ministry of Science and Technology of China, and the UNEP also published a series of work talking about technical cooperation on water resources in Africa. Next. In addition, I could see clear involvement of Chinese private sector and the NGOs. This picture is an event that was held at the China Pavilion. It's called Powering a Brighter Tomorrow. For example, China Energy Conservation and Environmental Protection Group, ENN, GCL Solar Energy Limited. These are the enterprises who made their presence felt by introducing practice and actions of Chinese energy companies in low-carbon development, demonstrating their ambition to provide integrated energy solution to power a brighter tomorrow. Next. And also we could see very active involvement of NGO groups. I had the opportunity to interview some of them, and these are just some of the key points that I would like to share with you all. They all thought the NGOs had a very rapid development in recent years. They applauded government's initiative to interact with them in the policymaking process. They stressed the importance of staff training in order for them to disseminate accurate information at a grassroots level, because that's very important. But they really wished to receive more funding from local private enterprises. Next. There was unanimous acknowledgement that China's current effort on climate change mitigation and adaptation in Durban. However, the road ahead is not a smooth one. I'm quoting Mr. Martin Kaur, the executive director of the South Center. He said this at one of the side events. China receives little support from other countries because it seems to be very rich. And we know that it's not. China also has many other problems, so we know there are a lot of challenges ahead. Next. So at the last, okay. Just before I end, at the last General Assembly of COP17, China's head delegate, Ms. Xie Zhenghua, made a very impassioned speech backing India and questioning the developed countries. Many of us know about it. I apologize that I couldn't find the English translated version online, but basically he said, what qualifies you, developed countries, to tell us what to do? We've done our part, and we want to see your action. So it was a really powerful speech, and we would really like to see China continue being a powerful and influential player, making positive changes in future international climate change negotiations. Thank you very much. And I will hand it to Graciela.
Okay, so Kelly and I focused much of our work in Durban looking at the other big player at the time, the United States. And as we saw it, for the United States, Durban was an opportunity to propose operational outcomes. So working based on the existing Copenhagen and Cancun agreements. So negotiators Todd Stern and Jonathan Pershing were focused more heavily on implementing those existing agreements rather than on implementing a new legal framework for the post-Kyoto, post-2012 period. As we know, the result was 4 really important words: an agreed outcome with legal force. And this was expected from all countries by 2015. While the content of that agreement hasn't yet been developed, some of the really important things that came out of it were, for example, it eliminates the really sharp distinctions that existed between developed and developing country responsibilities. So under the Kyoto Protocol, countries were had common but differentiated responsibilities according to their respective annex. By contrast, under the Durban platform, all countries are expected to commit to binding emissions reductions by 2020. And this was a huge part of what allowed the United States to agree to this platform, whereas it couldn't with Kyoto. Now, there's still some disagreement among countries such as China and India regarding the precise legally binding nature of those 4 words. Next. We also focused heavily on finance, as this was one of the United States' big priorities coming into Durban. So first, the Green Climate Fund, which is a mechanism through the UNFCCC to provide funding for adaptation and mitigation projects in vulnerable countries. And regarding the US's position, they were focused pretty heavily on articulating that they expected much of their contribution to come from the private sector. But that remains a point of contention, exactly how we're going to balance private and public sector contributions. Secondly, in Durban, the United States delegation released the Fast Start Finance Report for 2011, fiscal year 2011, and they summarized their contribution for fiscal year 2011 as $3.1 billion, 1.8 of that coming from congressionally appropriated assistance, and about 1.3 coming from development finance and export credit agencies. And lastly, of particular interest to me in my research, right after Durban in February, President Obama released his fiscal year 2013 budget proposal, which is the last of his current term. And it allocated, or it requests, about $769 million in climate-related funding. And compared to fiscal years 11 and 12, that's a pretty big decrease. So as you can see, in this group, we're pretty highly attuned to finance and issues of the distribution of such finance. So for more on that, I'm going to turn it over to Spencer.
Thank you so much. So some of the other main issues that we looked at in Durban kind of revolve around answering these three main questions. So where does the funding come from? Who governs the funding once it arrives in recipient countries, or how are the funds governed? And how are the funds allocated? What sort of projects are being funded? And who decides where those funds go? So that goes back to the governing. So in order to influence better policies at the negotiations kind of around answering these questions and other questions regarding climate finance on an international level, we focused on three main issues, which were improving the transparency of climate finance overall, on promoting new sources of adaptation funding and finance, and on supporting the least developed countries groups, negotiating group. So with that, before Durban, we produced a few policy briefs, two of which were with the International Institute for Environment and Development, scoring transparency in the Fast Start finance period, and also one suggesting different sources of adaptation finance. And one of our other policy briefs was specifically targeting the least developed countries, and it was a brief that those negotiators could hand to negotiators from wealthier Annex 1 countries and say, this is what you promised us, this is what we've received in terms of climate finance, and this is what we still need. And while we were told that our policy briefs were useful and helpful in the negotiation process, not much progress was made towards achieving the goals that we set out prior to Durban, with the main progress in climate finance being movement towards the operationalization of the Green Climate Fund, as Graciela was just talking about. So moving forward, we'll continue to work towards those main goals with continuing some old projects, most notably continuing our collaboration with the Least Developed Countries Group, writing some more policy briefs about funding within those countries and where those sources of finance are. We'll continue to track adaptation finance and improvements on transparency, hoping to provide and publish new briefs with IIED, following up on the ones that we've published in the past. And we're looking at exploring the role of climate finance, kind of the power of climate finance in overall global climate politics, as Dave was talking about in the book that Timmons, Dave, and Mizan are working on, trying to understand how conditional aid and things like that can influence the overall climate politics. And finally, of particular interest, we are working on increasing, well, a new project that is an animated video that will hopefully, we're producing with the help of the Watson Institute here at Brown, that will hopefully help to raise awareness of the need for improvements in the world of climate finance. So I'll pass it on to Brianna Crouch, who's going to talk about the least developed countries.
All right. So my role in Durban was a bit different from my other lab members. I was supporting the least developed countries negotiating bloc exclusively for 3 weeks in South Africa. So just a bit of intro. The LDCs make up 48 of the world's countries who are going to be most vulnerable to climate change. 33 of them are in Africa, 10 are in Asia, 5 are in the South Pacific, and 1 is in the Caribbean. So, next. The bloc is currently chaired by Mr. Pa Osman Jarju, who's the man featured in the yellow suit, and he is from the Gambia. The spokeswoman is Ms. Sandra Vietas of Togo, and she's the woman in the blue next to him. And the LDCs really came to Durban with some pretty strong goals for the negotiation. I'll just highlight 3. First, they wanted a second and subsequent commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol that would ensure no break between the end of the first commitment period in 2012 and the beginning of a second. Their second major goal was to come to a legal outcome under the AWGLCA that would lay out a clear roadmap for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And then a third major goal was to get the Green Climate Fund really up and running so that its work could start. So my role was I basically got to follow Pa and Ms. Achala Chandri, who's the woman in the silk blouse standing in front of me, for 3 weeks. Ms. Chaudhry offers legal counsel to the LDC group, and she is with the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is based in London. So, next slide.
This is the one that takes a long time to load.
Oh,
Sure.
yeah, pictures. So these were my 3 weeks. The first week was really before the negotiations began. I helped coordinate and run the LDC preparatory meetings in which they kind of laid out their strategy for the upcoming negotiations. The first week of COP17, I was following negotiators around and learning what the nitty-gritty of COPs look like. And then the third week, I helped schedule and got to sit in on some ministerial level meetings that resulted in the Durban platform in the very early hours of Sunday morning. So yeah, these pictures kind of give an overview of the Chinese and American delegations up there on the top right. Pa and Ambassador John Ashton of the UK shaking hands down there. The LDCs, AOSIS, and the EU had a bit of coalition going in Durban, and that was very interesting to see. And the bulk of my work was really supporting the Gambian delegation as they chaired the LDC. And I got your picture down there on the bottom right. So yeah, so those were my 3 weeks in Durban and my first COP experience. So, and it has definitely impacted my thesis work going forward, which will now, as Caroline said, focus on the intersection between LDCs and tech transfer, and determining whether their goals are being reflected in policy. So, yeah. And now we have Adam, who's going to talk about climate smart agriculture.
Cool, thanks, Brianna. So along with Becca Keene in the front row here, I was looking at issues of agriculture in Durban. Well, just a little bit of background. Agriculture is a very important piece of the puzzle in terms of both adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation in the sense that agricultural systems in a lot of places need to be adapted to climate change and often need resources to enable that process, and then mitigation in the sense that agriculture is estimated to contribute between 14 and 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so there are potentially a lot of opportunities to use carbon reduction and carbon sequestration technologies and practices in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. So despite all of that, agriculture does not have an official place in the UNFCCC process. And there are a number of different reasons for that, some of which were reflected this year in Durban. Durban was a big year for agriculture, probably the biggest in terms of the number of discussions that were going on around climate change actions on agriculture. And in particular, there was a lot of talk leading up to the negotiations about establishing a working group on agriculture, which would have sort of solidified a set of actions and figured out exactly what the UNFCCC could do in terms of agricultural action. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you are, that process did not move forward too much. There was sort of a procedural move to continue discussing the option of a working group, and we were looking at the reasons why that happened. In a lot of senses, well, so the big buzzword that was thrown about a lot was climate smart agriculture, as Brianna mentioned, which we sort of discovered to be a very difficult term to unpack. There are various reasons why people push an idea called climate smart agriculture and various definitions of what that means to different people. In particular, a lot of civil society groups in some developing countries were a little bit, there was more of a focus on mitigation actions seen through their eyes than on adaptation actions, which were perceived as more important to certain groups. And so there was a lot of dispute about what climate smart agriculture should mean moving forward. So we had some really interesting conversations with various people about those issues, and right now we are preparing some blogs and reports about what climate smart agriculture means to different groups. And then we're also analyzing some documents that were submitted to the UNFCCC regarding possibilities for agriculture in the future to sort of see where that goes down the line, moving towards the next negotiations in December. And I'll pass it on to Kelly, who's going to give a brief note.
Yeah, Graciela did such a good job explaining the U.S. policy that the only thing I want to say is you should pick up a copy or ask us to send you a copy of the Brown Report from Durban, which is a more comprehensive approach of all of our issue areas and work products as well.
And I think we're going to pass it to Digital Guy, who will come up again for us.
Right, Guy, with a really quick wrap up on what happened with Latin America in the negotiations in Durban.
Right. Okay, thanks. So another key region for the lab's research is Latin America and the Caribbean. Latin America's role at the UN CCC has become increasingly visible, and in particular in 2010, when the Mexican presidency of COP16 in Cancun rescued the talks from the brink of disaster. Again, at the COP17 in Durban, Latin American countries continue to play an active role in both forging consensus and criticising the lack of ambition at the talks. Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So Latin America and the Caribbean has many voices at the climate talks. The region has never spoken with one voice, displaying instead a rich mosaic of perspectives. There are a number of groups, such as the Alliance of Small Island States, Brazil's membership of BASIC, ALBA, the Cartagena Dialogue for Progressive Action, the Environmental Integrity Group, the Central American Integration System, the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, and the Group of Highly Vulnerable Countries. These groups have diverse priorities. For example, AOSIS has historically called for highly ambitious mitigation targets that BASIC, including Brazil, have found unacceptable. On the other hand, Bolivia has questioned market mechanisms that other Latin American countries defend. But on key issues, Latin America does share some common goals, as demonstrated in Durban, such as the need for a second commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol, a new and stronger mitigation regime, and ensuring an outcome on the Green Climate Fund. So, 3 key questions for Latin America in 2012 and at the COP18 in Qatar. Firstly, how will those Latin American and Caribbean countries pushing for a high ambition coalition act in the run-up to and at the COP18? Secondly, what is the future of ALBA at the climate talks following the continued fragmentation of the G77 plus China group? And lastly, will Mexico, Brazil, and the ALBA countries offer competing visions of regional leadership on climate change in relation to the Durban platform in 2012? So, to conclude, the Durban platform offers the opportunity for Latin America to be less shy about its pledges at home, build stronger voices internationally, and to ensure that perspectives such as majority in the middle are not left aside as the largest emitters fight their case. It's time to work outside the comfort zone and to reach out to similar voices in Africa, Asia, and the small island states. Only an effective coalition of like-minded parties inside and outside government will ensure that the Durban platform delivers ambitious outcomes consistent with climate science. And that's it.
So this is you again, Dave, right?
Sure. Looking ahead to Doha for the next COP, we just want to highlight 3 main issues, what we can call the 3 gaps that we see we face moving forward. The first is the finance gap. We know that Fast Start Finance is supposed to take us through 2012. We know we're supposed to have $100 billion by 2020, and there's a big gap between that, and very little that's been decided in the interim period of what that's going to look like and how the finance is going to meet the increasing demand as more and more countries face impacts of climate change. The second gap is the time gap, or the mitigation gap. And this is that in terms of what's going to be required action internationally, we know that that's not going to take shape until 2020, or it's not going to be implemented until 2020. So there's a question of what happens in the meantime, and how much warming does this lock us into, and what can we do to improve that. And the third gap is a gap that's been discussed here a lot, which is the political gap. And that's, we talked about a lot between the US and China in determining number one and number two in current emissions. How are we going to get past this impasse that's been here for a long time? And I think we can look beyond the US and China and look at other political gaps as well that we need to address. With that, thank you very much.
Just one point. Thank you all for your patience, and we appreciate your questions. But I just want to say this group is not a class. They're getting no credit for this. They're not being paid. And they had to actually, to go to the talks, had to go around with the begging bowl to every dean and department chair and center director on campus to raise the funds. So I really admire they're so interested in this issue, and they work so well together as a team. So I really want to thank them for that. It's really great. So should we have about 15 more minutes, maybe a little less, so we can make sure we have a break and then get back for 3.
We're going to take a break. Are there questions for this group? I'm sure there are. Paul?
Just a quick question. After you saw the entire process, you saw it intimately in a way that I haven't seen, did you come away optimistic that civilization is going to be able to realistically take care of this problem? Are you now an liberal internationalist after this? Just out of curiosity.
I'm an international relations concentrator, Brown, so I study the United Nations far too often. And I would say that for me, it didn't make me optimistic, just because there were so many smart people there doing so many wonderful things, but the process that they had to work through and the insane bureaucracy that it takes to get those 5 words agreed on is a little mind-boggling. And in that sense, I found it very slow and disheartening.
I'm optimistic. After working with the LDCs and getting them all to agree, and then seeing that the world could agree on those 5 words just blew me away. In like 3 a.m. Sunday morning or something, when they'd all been up like 72 hours, seeing that ability to come together was actually there. So I guess we have varied opinions about
As we should, really.
Shoma?
I think such an impressive, dynamic group. Congratulations, really great job. I wish I could be as young as you and join you, to do something real. So I have some comments and also questions. And the first is about the dynamics of the COPs, like Durban, Cancun. I would say that there's a track, negotiating track, like Ben, you were at the top of there. And so that's the world of negotiators. But it's very important, now I've seen more and more, all these COPs, there's another track, to track the side events. And I think more people nowadays attend side events than the negotiators. So sometimes I think that this should not be called conference of parties. It's really conference of everybody. So in that sense, I would say this China Pavilion and at least World Guide, we are very happy because we have provided support, both technical and financial support for help them set up this pavilion. And it was quite impressive. Altogether, they have run 9 days. Every day is like 7 or 8 events, or 7 or 8 events. There's tremendous and work has been done. So if you look at it, depends on where you look. If you look at negotiating, you ask the negotiators frustration, they feel depressed. If you look at outside those side events, you feel inspired. So I really think that probably the conference part in this process, perhaps we're talking about bridging the gap, how these 2 worlds can somehow find a way to interact with each other. And secondly, there's a question when you probably take forward your project or the process. So one thing, of course, you talk about agriculture. The bank also is behind this. We want smart agriculture, but in general, it's nothing to do with the bank and others. I want to also raise this issue about all the issues that currently have been put forward or under discussion. under the UNFCCC. Back 1990s, I sound like an old woman, I guess. But there were like issues, I think probably just 10, 15 issues at the same time. So nowadays I remember probably altogether more than 15 issues on the table. So almost every possible issue, there. And my question is that whether UNFCCC is right forum to discuss, develop guidelines on all those issues. Because if you look at the composition of delegation and the competence, whether they are all the right people, to really give guidance on how to do a particular, probably very specialized, there's some issues and areas. So that's really the question. And the third, I also want to, that's really my personal view, as we move forward, of course, people talk about how the different type of regime for post-2020 or post-2012. And I do say that we are very pleased to say how, from 1990 to now, how the development has been really integrated or is being integrated into climate issue. We always say that we really have to, climate change is not about environment, it's about development. And that means that we are seeing that Cancun agreements refer to low carbon development, so it's already there, and so we look at all the issues, the discussions. But then the question that we talk about legally binding treaty in the future, that's really a pure question. So the question is that whether it's possible to have a legally binding treaty on development, covering so many issues. And if you look, so that's a question. Yeah, we are talking about climate change, about energy security, food security. We have also gender issues, social issues, economic issues, energy issues, environment all together. So with all those dimensions, different aspects, is this possible? It's a really pure question. We can have a treaty on development.
Rio is coming up, so.
Well, why don't you try that? It's a little tricky because there's this question about whether or not you can reconcile increased development, population, and energy. No, I don't hear takers. Then you had your hand up first.
I
did. Okay.
Tackle your second question, sort of, about whether or not all of these issues could be encompassed under the UNFCCC or whether they even should. Yeah, I think that the focus, at least this year from my experience and also last year in Cancun, specifically in terms of agriculture, I do think that there is a value to incorporating those discussions, and I think that the process of working towards some kind of a working group or some kind of an agreement is valuable in itself. I don't know actually if, once it's implemented, if the value would be worth the process, but I think that continuing the discussion and having it so intimately involved with this, the broader issues of climate change is valuable in some way. And I don't know, it would be interesting to talk about your thoughts on that later.
Debbie, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, you've done a great job, and I have two suggestions for your future work. So the first is relating to support for the LDCs. I think one of the big differences between Durban and Copenhagen, and the reason it succeeded in moving things forward, and I actually think there was progress at Copenhagen, getting as much agreement. This is an incremental process. It takes a lot of time. But I think one of the huge differences was that you actually had two huge coalitions develop. That I don't think it's fair to say that the US and BASIC wrote the Copenhagen Accord. A lot of it was drafted before that final meeting, but the reality is at that final meeting, only one of the two coalitions was represented, if you think about Durban. And the real success at Durban was the EU, AOSIS, and the LDCs recognizing that they had common ground and being a strong enough coalition to essentially face down the US and BASIC. And I think that's an enduring division. And it's useful to have two clear coalitions because then it's clear who's negotiating with who. And so I think that actually can help move things forward. And what that probably needs is more support for the LDCs and AOSIS and working with the EU to make that last and make them feel like they're actually able to make progress in that way. I think it was great that the EU figured out how to do that in Durban. And I think that's going to move forward. I don't think that progress is going to be made by the U.S. and BASIC, as you have it in your last line, deciding who's going to go first. There needs to be pressure from the outside, and that's clearly where that pressure comes from in terms of the agreement. I still tend to believe that for most large countries, and that's what the U.S. and BASIC represent, are very large countries, these kinds of decisions are mostly made domestically. And that was my point about China, is that there are a lot of domestic drivers for change. And so the number one most important thing in the United States is how do we create those domestic drivers for change. My second suggestion for you is to, in addition to looking at climate finance, is when you're evaluating what countries are doing, follow the money. And I thought Graciella's point about looking at the Obama budget was a very good one. And I suggest doing the same thing when you're looking at Chinese rhetoric and programs in the pavilion. If you look at South-South cooperation, how much money is going to development projects versus how much is going to fossil fuel development, I don't think they're in anywhere near the same orders of magnitude. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric, but it's important to see where the money is actually coming from. Similarly, while there's rhetoric about whether LDCs are getting money or the Chinese are getting money, if you look at how much money has gone through various climate change mechanisms and how much has wound up in China, it's actually not inconsiderable, whether it be from the World Bank or through the CDM or other things. The Chinese have actually done very well to date. One of the issues, I think, for the LDCs is how, given weak institutions, to take advantage of international mechanisms that increasingly require sort of strong reporting and governance and other structures that typically it's been more middle-income developing countries have been much better equipped to take advantage of. But think about where the money's going, not just the rhetoric.
Well, there's somebody who wants to respond, and there are 3 more questions, and then we'll, I think, stop. You're going to pass?
No, come on. Come on.
Sure. You're good to hear from you. Do you have a response to that? I think you are trying to chase the money, but David, go ahead.
This is actually still replying to the previous comment. And I think one of the things we're definitely trying to do with your comment is really try to get a better sense of the money, which is oftentimes really difficult because of the fragmented nature. And I think Timmons's work with aid data is at the cutting edge of some of that, and also WRI, of course. I just wanted to one of my learnings in Durban, or just kind of where I've come to be thinking about more, is I don't think I think the UNFCCC process is any less important, but I think, especially considering the time gap, that I do think it's important if national efforts are going to be a focus, that what countries can do outside of this framework. I think we also have to look at other global governance structures like the World Trade Organization to make sure that individual countries can take actions on climate change in a constructive way.
It's an interesting player to bring into the talk for a moment. Dan, you had a question?
Well, I kind of wanted to ask, I was impressed when Timmons mentioned that each of you went to Durban on your own. You got no credit for it. You had to beg the money for it. You know, obviously you're all dedicated people. So I wanted to ask each of the people sitting up there, has your life been changed in any way? Are you going to continue with this in the future, or is this just sort of passing through?
We should go down the table then.
Yeah.
Really quick. Kelly.
So for me, I was in Copenhagen, Cancun, and Durban. And so I think by Durban, it makes me very tired. You know, and so I want to keep working on this, but I have to keep finding pockets of hope in the system. So I graduate in May, and hopefully I'll head to DC and find some more motivation to keep working on it.
Yeah, I think I was in Cancun as well as Durban this year, and it's definitely broadened my scope. I mean, I'm doing my thesis work on agriculture and climate adaptation in the US, but I think going and working with Timmons and the rest of the lab has really broadened my scope a lot to the international context, especially I've learned a lot about issues of development and sort of how this issue fits into all of those questions, which are obviously huge. So yeah, I'd say so, and I'm hoping to continue on in some way looking at these issues after I get out of school.
Durban was my first, but I'll be in Bonn in a few weeks. And I definitely have plans to go to Doha and keep on going. So loved the work and loved the people.
Yeah, I certainly, while perhaps not optimistic, perhaps I was not optimistic leaving Durban, I was certainly inspired. And I think I would really love to continue working on these issues, and I think they are some of the largest issues that face all of us. And so to be at the forefront of that is really intriguing. It's just kind of finding the appropriate arena to keep working on all these things.
Durban was my first experience as well, and Spencer and I were there the first week, so we weren't there when sort of all the 4 a.m. decisions actually happened. Not that we would have been behind those doors anyway, but it was a different scene to be there the first week rather than the second. And I would reiterate what Kelly said about sort of finding the pockets where I want to work. I've found it really rewarding to work on specific research projects. I've spent this year basically working on the US stuff, so I did a study on Obama's rhetoric, and then I've incorporated that into a paper comparing the rhetoric and the money. So how do those two line up? And for me, that's been really, really interesting, and I can see already that some of it it's gotten some reception, some feedback, which is really great. So I don't know if, secretly I sort of want to be the next Jonathan Pershing, but I also maybe just want to work on sort of those pockets of research.
So same as Greta, it was my first COP, so it was certainly inspiring, very interesting. And I want to echo Xueman's point. I thought the side events were just as precious as the negotiations, and I believe in the future the side events will help to generate very fruitful products.
For me, as a graduate student, as a PhD student for a 5-year process, this has made me feel that being able to at least contribute in small ways during this process and feel like I'm doing some really tangible work has been a real benefit and has kind of kept my soul intact. And I feel like, just echoing Kelly's point, kind of the 3rd year of this, I was at a talk that Christiana Figueres said that she overheard someone talking on the phone at COP17, and they were like, yeah, I'm here at COP71, and they mixed up the numbers, and she just thought it was so apropos, so right on. It does seem how it feels sometimes.
It ages you. That's a very nice question. Very nice to ask them this. Yinwan, you had a question?
Oh, okay, all right.
And then we'll
okay,
move on to the next.
Because of the time limit, I just have 2 quick comments. Okay, the report is very well, and the discussion is quite fruitful. My first comment is about China is very rich. Actually, in China, the new poverty standard is annual income per capita is 2,300 RMB. It equals about $1 one day per capita. According to the new standard right now in China, there's totally 128 million poverty people. The concept of the population, the poverty population in China, the concept is nearly equal the whole population in Japan. So right now, because there's a rapid economic development in China, to have the impression that China is very rich, but actually not. We have a huge population, poverty population. That's one point I'd like to comment. The second is about the international support to China's action to address the climate change. Especially, I'd like to talk about the adaptation. Right now, there are 4 possible foundations for adaptation. The LDC Foundation, the Special Foundation, the AF, and the Green Climate Foundation. Because the Green Climate Fund, the mechanism right now is not yet ready. For the other 3 foundations, actually, for the LDC and the Special Foundation, for China, no opportunity to apply, to get the foundation. And for the adaptation fund, I just joined the UNFCCC Secretariat, organized the training course about the accreditation for the foundation. My personal feeling is China is nearly excluded for this foundation. It's a small amount, but I personally feel. So that's a problem is in China, because we have the huge amount of poverty population. But for this huge poverty population, excluded from the International Adaptation Fund. So that's really the problem for the equity. It's fair. I don't think, just as I have the presentation in the morning, that in China, in the developing countries, adaptation is the least cost for the mitigation, the relation between the mitigation and adaptation. So I just raise the problem, the question that it's fair, and also because it's the first time for me to join the discussion like this, I personal feeling is that the communication is really important. I feel sometimes the outside world doesn't consider the Chinese problems, questions with Chinese way. So I think I just want to say try to consider Chinese matters with Chinese way. I cannot describe how hard for Chinese to do the efforts, to make the efforts for to address the climate change problem. For example, to raise the energy efficiency, something like that.
So
okay, all right.
Okay, all right. Conversation.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you.
No, I can't speak on behalf of the United States, but this is a somewhat cynical response, and that is China's growing at 9% a year. Its economy is growing very rapidly, and as far as I can tell, the U.S. economy is looking more or less like this, very trivial compared to China. And as I bet you know, we also have one of the most diverse, or the highest Gini coefficients in the world, with something like 1.5% of the population controlling a lot of the wealth of the United States. We have something like 11% of the population qualifying as being malnourished, undernourished. So there are different ways to understand poverty and wealth and growth and who can pay for what. And adaptation, everybody's going to have to pay. I would second Senator Whitehouse's notion that laws of nature, everybody obeys laws of nature. China, US. But thank you so much to you guys for your work. And Lucky Devil's going to Durban, and then whoever gets to go on next and represent the US there is the next generation. Good for you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And thanks, everybody, for your attention on that. So let's take about a 10-minute break. How about that? And we'll start at 3:15.